Welcome to Behind the Citgo, where we pull back the curtain on the unseen truth of addiction recovery and talk about things most people never get a chance to see. I'm your host, Josh Torbich. Each week, we're sitting down with people who lived it, led it, and are still learning from it today. This isn't polished, it's real, it's raw, and it's noted in the faith and hope because we do recover. So whether you're in recovery, walking alongside someone who is, or just trying to understand what healing really looks like, you came to the right place. Let's dig in. Hey, what's up, everyone? Welcome back Behind the Citgo. The doctor is in the house, everyone. Dr. Gary Nelson. Doctor, you become such a good friend. I'm learning so much from you, and it's just natural progression in time, and I'm so happy we get to have a conversation today. So thank you for making the trip down.
It's good to be here.
It was a nasty trip.
It was a bit wet, little dreary coming down, and you can refer to me as Gary because I think sometimes when you say doctor, it creates a distance.
That's a good point.
It's hard to know whether or not when you say doctor, is it a compliment or a diss?
But I say it as an endearment.
Oh, good.
You know, it's like a fun, kind of like how I call Robin Captain.
That's true.
It's when I call you doctor, it's a term of endearment. Yeah, so don't take that away from me.
Appreciate that.
Now, I do know what you're saying because, if you wanted to keep me distance, you would say, call me doctor, right?
Yeah.
So just to know that I still choose to call you doctor, even though I know you like Gary.
Okay.
It's a term of endearment.
You're good.
Yeah.
Let's establish that.
And then the folks also have to know before we get to chatting that I surprised you with the worst road to drive down.
A bit of a pothole. Guys, next time I'll bring a 4-wheel drive.
It's one big pothole.
It is.
But it's a long road. Yeah. So not all great things happen whenever someone buys you a campus, but the road comes with the campus. So we'll keep it.
Life has potholes.
That's true. It's a good analogy for life. I've read your book, and I've read some parts of it twice. Self-governance in communities and families. And I want it to, before we get started, can we talk a little bit about the framework that you were in when you wrote that work, the work that you were doing, the kind of information you were collecting to kind of inform that work? Because today we're talking about self-governance as a pathway to freedom.
Yes, I think my focus has always been to work with large systems to get them to be more responsive to communities and to families and to individuals, to kind of build community from the bottom up as opposed to directing it from the top down. So I think you need both large systems, but we need different kinds of systems, but we need more engaged communities and families to take ownership for their futures and their aspirations and to learn how to self-regulate and hold themselves accountable, and the government to be there to support them, but not necessarily to always direct them and tell them what to do.
And it all works together. You were kind of sharing, and I'm always inspired by our conversations, whenever you share these things with me, because one of my favorite things that you say is that there's not one system or not one branch that can do it alone. So you really are, like what you're saying, the both and person. Make all of these things collectively sing a song that works together. And that's where your interest has been for your career.
Yeah, no, very much. I think I often have a phrase I use, some of my colleagues that recognize it, and they'll say, now he's going to say both and. It's because I think in the way we approach problems, sometimes it's either government or community. And it's for anybody who knows who lives in a community, in the society, it's both.
Both.
But you may want to have some changes in community. You may want to have a different sense of government. But when this country was first established in terms of democracy, it was to foster self-governance.
Talk a little bit about what self-governance means. And when you say self-governance, what are you really saying?
Yeah, so when I say this, self-governance, I go back to an individual who wrote perhaps the best book ever written about democracy. And it was Alexis de Tocqueville in the 1830s, and it's called Democracy in America. So he had a concept that was center to that book, which was self-governance, rightly understood. By that, it meant that rather than starting with my interests, my ends, my needs, that I start with you, Josh, and ask you what it is that you aspire to, what it is you're trying to accomplish. And then I earn your trust by not first trying to get my thing done, but I actually begin the process engagement by helping you accomplish your ends. And I find that often people talk about ends as opposed to means. They often want this very similar ends. They want families that thrive. They want to be successful. They want to be respected. So self-governance, rightly understood, is a bit of a paradox because it means not starting with me, but starting with you. And how can I help you? And then by doing that, more likely to earn your respect. You're more likely to be there to help me when I have a particular thing I need to accomplish because you'll have a sense of you received some kind of gift and you want to exchange that gift. You want to pay it back.
That's absolutely true. Your instincts take you there very quickly. That when you start with trust, because you've put someone else's interests above your own, that you can oftentimes move faster once you get through the first part of
Yeah.
that relationship.
And I'll say that, when you self governance, when you hear that, you hear self. And I think in many ways, our culture has become so highly individualistic. You can say self almost as selfish. And I think we've become a culture of what's called transactional self interest, which is that I'm here to take something from you, Josh, to meet my needs, as opposed to I'm here to support you and to give you something, respect, in the belief that in fact you'll then do the same for me. So I think we've become very transactional, very unidirectional of taking, whether or not it's government or individuals or commerce. And in doing that, leave people very bruised and not very happy about having been taken.
Yeah, you start with kind of what others can do for you, and oftentimes people have to buy their way into you
Yeah, I get
on
there.
their behalf. You've coined a phrase that I use frequently, and it's called reciprocal altruism. Is that the answer to transactional self interest?
Yeah, I think it is. It's again, the notion that altruism is a two-way street. I was talking to a family member and they were having a bit of a tiff and that it was getting together for Thanksgiving and they weren't invited. And I said, well, do you actually reach out to them and do you invite them to your things? It's a little bit like, I'm not getting any letters. Well, do you send them? If you don't send letters, if you don't reach out, you can't necessarily expect somebody to do something you're not doing. So it is that kind of notion to be the end in mind, model that thing that you think is valuable, but you have to begin by modeling it.
There's a lot that what you're saying is instinctually a part of the 12-step program. The process that oftentimes, like one of my favorite quotes, um, is that you became willing, the big book says this, you became willing to make amends to others, even though they still might be in your mind slightly more to blame.
Yeah.
So you start with your part, and hopefully that does model the behavior that at some point the entire relationship has restoration involved with it.
No, very much. And when you said that, what I hear also is that we're too quick to assume something about somebody by how they look, how they walk, how they talk, their class, their gender, is don't start with your assumptions about that person because they're likely to be very thin and perhaps inaccurate. Learn who that person is, ask questions, get to know them, become engaged, so you can be informed as opposed to jumping to a conclusion. You're of this political party, you're of this particular faith or no faith. Therefore, I'm off to the races because I have you pegged as a certain kind of individual. So it's like, hold your horses, wait, check out your assumptions.
And it goes against natural instincts as far as the way, I don't know if it's would consider born, but what you're describing, you have to train yourself to be that way because it goes against, why does that go against our nature? Uh, why do what you're saying is to hold off on developing inferences that you haven't tested yet? Why is that against human nature, it seems?
I don't know that, I don't know that it's against human nature. And so the one thing I've learned in terms of working with you and to work with Christian recovery centers and Christian 100 is learning more about faith. And so part of that, again, is both and. We have a capacity to be incredibly generous and we have a capacity to be really bad. So that's our nature. It's both. is what is and what ought to be.
Wow.
So it's not one or the other again. It's that dualism that is very false. And so,
What you're saying is, I just want to slow down here because I never thought about it this way. It's in us to be both.
yes,
Yeah. And when you talk about that, what you're really saying is you get to choose which one you're in pursuit of because you're born with both abilities.
yeah, I guess that would call free will. But choices have accountability too.
Hmm.
And cultures and society run into a lot, or individuals run into a lot of difficulty when we don't hold ourselves to account and we're not held to account by our families or our communities. So it really goes off the rails, when you get away with things that you shouldn't be getting away with, or you do things that are right and you're not rewarded for it, not incentivized for it. But we do have the capacity for both.
You said you made a phrase. I've always enjoyed this phrase that you made, but it's what ought to be.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I think, and I think this goes to the notion of how to tap into your better nature. Is I think we have a capacity when we stop and think about what it is that we value. So I'll say, and you've heard this, I would use a phrase with people I work with, we know better than we do. That I think that we have a capacity that when we're mindful and kind of think about what we value, and as opposed to being reactive and reflexive and quick and self-interested, that we tap into something deeper. We tap into, I think we all have an internal sense of goodness, call it soul, call it, I was brought up by my parents to be this kind of person. I've been mentored. I know better. So it's tapping into that, and to remember that and work from that place as opposed to, being more reactive and self-interested.
Yeah, when you see people who are becoming more and more dependent on external things, you would say that they've traded some of their responsibility. And sometimes you and I have trickled into these conversations about how actually assuming responsibility that you consider meaningful is one of the greatest gifts to an individual. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, very much. And so I think terms like dependence and independence are very loaded. And so again, when we hear a word, we often jump to it means this as opposed to checking it out. So the idea of dependence, we live in a culture where um, there's a judgment made that dependence is bad. Children are dependent on their parents. In a community, we're dependent on each other. You can call that interdependence. So dependence is not necessarily bad, but it becomes bad when we're held account for certain things and control, but we don't have the freedom to choose. So that's dependence. A lot of dependence that we have in this culture in terms of our welfare system has been created. It's by design. This may be off the different kind of path, but often when people talk about this culture, this society, and they talk about the welfare system, and they talk about the dependencies created, it is actually, my belief, created by design. It's just created to control people as opposed to, and to make a judgment about those people, those others are somehow different than me. I'm an independent person, they're dependent people, as opposed to they are like me, they have the capacity for both. And if you design a system that incentivizes dependence, it's the system that owns some responsibility for that. For yourself, in terms of if anybody in this culture is middle class or up middle class, you know, I'm dependent on the government, but in a very different way. I get all kinds of subsidies for my health care, for my retirement, my kids were in school, on and on. But nobody sees that as dependence, because I have a choice about that. And it's so seamless. I don't even think of it as government. But people who are poor, what they experience in terms of welfare benefits is very, very different.
Yeah, what you're saying is that the poor in our country has the subsidies of welfare, but then the middle class and wealthy do as well. They appreciate subsidies on an
Sure.
everyday basis.
But on very different terms.
Yours, yeah, you would say yours make you more free to
Yeah,
exercise what you value and believe in. They don't come with stringent rules attached to them, right?
right. I always had this image of if people know the story of Gulliver being tied to the ground. A lot of our systems, in terms of people who are working class or poor, is like being tied to the ground. All these separate kind of programs have rules and regulations. It's very hard to stand up to be independent. When you're running from one program to the next, to deal with there's assessments, there's regulations. That you do this and you can't do that. That actually hobbles a person in their ability and it turns them into a very different individual as opposed to what I experienced, really enables me to have a certain security about my healthcare, my retirement, my kids' education that enables me to spend more of my time being creative and to be more giving individual. So, yeah, we have very different kinds of welfare systems based on who you are in this country.
What does the pursuit of self-governance look like? If you were to say, I'm in pursuit of this ideal that we're describing today, paint that picture of what an individual in pursuit of self-governance looks like in a healthy way.
In a healthy way, for me, it would be if I were to ask you, Josh, what is your highest aspiration? And then I asked you, you identified it. It may have been to have a healthy family and see your kids successful and have a great marriage and to give back to the community. That aspiration, then I would say, well, then how do you pursue that? How do you kind of make that happen? What gets in your way makes it difficult. What happens that makes it easier? That's pursued. But what's common is each of us has aspirations, and they're very, very similar, irrespective of the circumstance we were born into, the family we were born into, the community we're born into. If I was born in the Schlote, it's very different. I was actually born in Idaho, in the Rocky Mountains. If I was born in the slums in Chicago, it'd be very different. So our context, impacts our pursuit, but it doesn't impact that internal kind of sense of aspiration of who we want to be as individuals.
While the ends look the same for so many people, you're right. The ends for where we're all, the majority of us hope that we're going or aspiring to be, they look very similar. We find our most common disagreements around the means on how we get there. And that kind of works to drive a wedge between families and communities. So how do you approach the conversations in the general sense when people disagree on the means, but their common ground is on the ends?
Yeah, so one would be to always start with ends as opposed to means, to acknowledge what we have in common before we acknowledge our differences. If we focus on our differences, it should be no surprise that we actually accentuate our differences. When we focus on our ends, we actually accentuate what we have in common. But in this culture presently, we're always focusing on means. And I would say that's actually perversely a way to simply drive self-interest. To do that, it's almost as if we didn't want to, break down partisan walls, if we didn't want to break down the walls between people of faith and people who don't express a particular kind of faith. So begin with the end in mind always, and then begin a discussion about, let's think about how to get there. What approach do you use? What might I suggest? And how can we learn together?
You talk about Gulliver, it's a great story, and it does paint the picture of what we're describing today about how Gulliver, he was, tied for those of the folks who don't know, he's laying on the beach and he's in the village of the little people and he's a giant and he's consuming all these resources. They're bringing them to him actually. They're bringing he's such a big guy and he's got these barrels that look like they're the size of a thimble, but they're huge to everybody else. And all these little people are bringing him all these resources. Um, and then he gets his stomach filled and he gets everything in him that he needed and all of his needs are met. But then he looks to the left and right and says, I can't move because he's all tied down. How is it that our society creates these dependencies for people that keep them tied down? What do those look like?
Well, I think the thing, I'm glad this is kind of free flowing conversation because
Absolutely.
it triggers certain kind of things. So I think in the same way, and I'll go back to Alexis de Tocqueville and writing in the 1830s, and he was 26 years old when he came to America. He was French, and he's wanted to go and see what was going on in this country. And when he did that, he identified that we had this incredible um, entity is called associations where people come to create something they couldn't create on their own, to build a house, to raise a child or whatever, but it took all of that community to do that. But he also saw something in this culture then that he said worried him about our future. We also had a tendency for hyper individualism, and a focus on the material and the commercial. So he worried that there'd come a time when we become more concerned with commercial interests, material interests, and less concerned with the intangible interests. And so I think now, in terms of, and I think this speaks to the work that you do in your program, is that people have both needs for the intangible, call it spirit, call it faith, call it trust, as well as go for receiving all the little pigs of food and stuff like that. But material alone doesn't quench the soul. So we've lost track of those subjective, those immaterial interests that are actually at the heart of who a person is. Whether that's respect, trust, you know, uh, wanting to be admired for what we've done.
Mhm.
So we give less attention to that and more attention to how big is your house, what kind of car you drive, what you can buy, and how you dress, as opposed to who you are and the essence of who you are.
You're really tapping into something that I'm becoming more and more passionate about between our work together. It's interesting to watch your like just for me personally to watch kind of my evolution of interest. Obviously, it's all been circulated around the work that I do in substance use disorder addiction recovery services. But as you get these new perspectives that are introduced by new friends and new experts in the field, you kind of start to create an energy, between that information that you're receiving and then applying it here. And one of the things I'll say that's really happening for me is this idea of how we don't really get to choose our day-to-day interactions as much as we get to choose the person that we're aspiring to be. And there is a sense of that kind of self-governance creating freedom for myself. Because if you looked, and this is what I guess kind of the joke is, if you looked at your day-to-day interactions, it's easy to perceive yourself as not free. Because today life threw me 10 things that I really didn't want to mess with or deal with. And you're
Yeah.
like, I wouldn't have, if I could have chosen my day, I wouldn't have So the joke is like, you don't really get to choose your day, but you do get to choose the person that you want to be, and who we're in pursuit of. And I watch that with people who are coming to the recovery program because, Gary, they've traded in a lot of, sense, their autonomy to come participate in our program, because they're not choosing what time to wake up, what time they eat lunch, what time, their decisions that they're making on a day-to-day basis are really majority sense governed by a system. Um, but they're doing that for today. They're doing that for today, knowing, hoping, praying, wishing that it leads them to the person that they want to be. They're in pursuit of this. In the Bible, it's referred to as guided by fire during the day and or a cloud during the day and fire by night. That they see this place, Gary. It's off yonder. What's
Yeah.
yonder? It could be right there, or it could be way over there, right? But they're in pursuit of something, and that's kind of what you're describing today is that you get to choose what you're in pursuit of, not necessarily what you get to interact with on a day-to-day basis.
I think it's true. But, the thing I think when you were saying that is all those interactions during the day that you have to do that are kind of life. You have to take care of certain kind of things. But each of those kind of life things involves an interaction with somebody else. And it's a choice about how you then interact with them. So if I have to, I'm moving to a new house and I have to get, the gas set up for the house, stuff like that. I have to call somebody. So that's a task I have to get done. But it's a much more pleasant task, when we engage each other in a respectful manner. So I think there are all those tasks in the day, but all those tasks are associated with how we treat each other. So in that sense, that your notion of the kind of cloud and then they haven't arrived. It's in each moment, they're both there. It's not something separate. I just have to get through this because if you get through something in a way that actually bruises everybody, you'll never get above.
Right.
So it's kind of like it's in the moment.
What's one of the what's one of the common misconceptions about self-governance that kind of keep people from embracing it fully?
Yeah, for me, it is when they get into the notion of self, what that means to them. And I think that means self interest, what I want, as opposed to self governance being how do I govern myself, as opposed to how do I govern you. So it is
Not the same thing.
not the same thing at all. It's like, so I think they hear somehow you're saying self governance sounds like a very individualistic thing. When paradoxically, it's not. It's actually a very eclectic thing because it takes you and I interaction together in a way that it builds my capacity for freedom, but also builds your capacity for freedom. So I think we filter through a lens of what we mean by individualism. You know, um, I think that distorts it. So it's paradoxical. Some ways, the less individualistic you are, the stronger individual you will be.
You have a good story that I enjoy hearing. I'm going to ask you to share it with me. But I think it paints a good picture of what self governance would look like if it were embraced. And you've told me this story about not necessarily knowing what's going on next door with your neighbor,
Yeah.
but being concerned about things that are way off in the distance. Can
No,
you share that perspective?
yeah. So we were doing what we call dialogues. And it was actually in Greenville, South Carolina, bringing the community together around child welfare, his end of the child welfare system, families that are broken up because of what's been going on in the family. And so we're doing this dialogue, and I remember it really jumped out at me. This individual said, when we talk about self governance, she said, when you said that in a different kind of way, this is what I remember about myself. She said, my daughter and I were watching television, and this is back in the 1990s, and it was involved what was going on in Europe and Serbia and Kosovo, this violence. And she saw that, that children were losing parents. And so she was moved to tears and she said to her daughter, we need to do something. So we need to adopt that child. But at the time she was doing it, then she noticed next door an ambulance pulled up in front of the house next door and went in and brought her neighbor out. And it struck her. She was so moved by somebody so far away. But next door, she had somebody who was in some difficulty, had some needs, and she knew nothing about them. So those things that are far sometimes appeal to us, but the opportunity to be there for people who are near, whether or not it's your children, your own family or your neighbor, that's where self-governance begins, meaning to her neighbor, if they're experiencing difficulty, is there something I can do? Can I help you? You don't have childcare after school and I'm home, your child can come to my house as opposed to being home alone. So she was really struck by that, that it said, to each of us that the challenge is actually to attend to what is in our space, in our own families, to make sure that we're being the best parents, we can be, that we're the best neighbor that we can be, as opposed to, this idea is it has to be far removed and I'll give to charity and take care of somebody distant that I'll never know and have responsibility for.
It's such
Is that what you're asking about?
exactly, yeah. It's such a good story because it really does cut to the core of the matter, which is the things which are I think what you're really saying is, with that story, it illustrates the idea of the thing that I could easily reach and influence in a positive way. I didn't have interest in.
Yeah.
but the things that were way off in the distance that I don't know, maybe I could touch, maybe I could do something. I was more moved by something that I had less potential to positively influence.
No, absolutely. And at the risk of another story,
Yeah.
the really stood out for me is that we were doing the similar kind of dialogue, but this was in Romania. Because Romania was a Soviet state at one time, a communist state. And if you're in a communist state, you don't have poverty because it goes against, you're not supposed to have poverty if your idea was the communist state. And so we were actually called into Romania in around 2000 because they had no child welfare system. All children went into orphanage, and they were trying to actually build back community, to have a system that would keep children with their families or with an aunt or uncle. So we were doing the same kind of thing, but it was a dialogue that involved the whole country. And after we had an event, we were in the mountains in Romania, and we were in a rustic lodge, and with my team, we're kind of talking amongst ourselves. And there was a table far away across the room, and there were these individuals who were 40s and 50s and 60s, who were in suits and ties. And for me, they looked obviously kind of Soviet bureaucrats, and this one individual stood up and they started coming toward our table. And I thought, oh no, one of these old bureaucrats, one of these old communists is going to come over here, say something really untoward. And he came over and he came directly up to me and he said, I want to say to you that what you did today spoke to my heart. And I was totally misinformed. I had totally made the wrong judgment. That one, this individual had a very different political ideology, also had a heart, and in his heart, he valued much the same thing, that I valued. And I would say this in terms of working with Robin Hayes, the book on self-governance. He probably read that book more closely, than many of my students. And he comes from a conservative background. So I was struck I always thought in some ways the book was actually kind of progressive and liberal. And I thought it was very interesting, that he found it really valuable, So that was that kind of intersection of interest between kind of whether or not just between individuals that we often value very similar things. But I remember that story because I try to remind myself, don't make assumptions about people. Don't leap to judgments about a person because of their faith, their party, their gender, their race, their background in terms of been experienced substance abuse. Do not make a judgment about who they are as individuals, because that possibility is still there, that it's true that we all have hearts. And if we listen to them, and listen to our internal sense of who we are, then we're much better people than we may appear to be on the surface.
Yeah, it's an incredible story, very insightful. And it talks, about our common prejudgments that only build things to separate us.
Yeah.
They put walls instead of bridges in between us.
Yep.
I think about when you're describing that too, every time you say Robin and his interest in the book, all I see are these little colorful tabs.
Same here.
Lining.
I couldn't believe that. That is amazing.
Well, and he quotes it to me all the time, and I've, I have to read your emails about 7 times before I understand them. So your book, I read it once, but there's sections that I've gone back and read, individually there just to remind myself. But he's always quoting it to me, different parts of it. And he's used a lot of it in a lot of the write-ups. And it makes me think about this idea. And it's not a new idea, but it's just one that maybe gets commonly overlooked, that we're all kind of more alike than we are different. And we have different backgrounds, politically, religious, all of these things, but we're more alike than we are different. We all mostly want the same ends. I have this kind of weird thing that I talk to my wife about, and I think it's relevant. I'm going to risk sharing it with you. But so LJ, my son, he's 4 now, and we listened to a podcast episode one time by someone who was sharing that she, as a mother of a 9-year-old, allowed her son to ride the subway station by himself because he insisted that he was ready for that step in his life. Okay, here's the catch. The subway system was in the middle of New York City. Um, and when you think of a subway system in the middle of New York City, you think, oh my goodness, what a dangerous place. But she came from this place to where she believed two things. Most people were good and most people were helpful, right? That there was, if they saw a boy 9 years old on the subway, that most people would be inclined to help, guide, direct, you know, what are you looking for type of question, or even just subtle nuances like, hang on to that pole when it takes off, something like that. So she was working from those conceptions, and her son, she said, you should have seen him. I remember this comment. You should have seen him when he came back, the badge of honor that he wore, just knowing that as a 9-year-old, independently, he took the subway station up and came right back around and made it home all by himself. She said he wore it like a badge of honor. He was so proud and so accomplished. So I joked with Casey and I said, Casey, what day do you think I can pull up to the Food Lion, the grocery store, hand LJ a credit card and ask him to go inside and buy a pack of gum for me? Just imagine the 4-year-old walking in and swiping the card to the counter. I kind of share that. Do you share the sentiment that the woman was, that most people are kind and most people are helpful?
No, I think it's absolutely true, because of the age I am. So I grew up in a time when we came home, a walk home from school,
Right.
and that could have been a mile. And now your child, you would never allow your child because it's such a dangerous world.
Right.
Even when you may have little evidence that it's dangerous, but we're creating that child a sense of fear, but also we undermine their ability to be self-reliant. We undermine the capacity to be self-regulating by protecting them. So I grew up in a highly unprotected environment that enabled me to be strong, and to take reasonable kind of risks. Right. I think you're absolutely right. There's something that's happened about this in this culture, that has in some ways undermined, you know, our capacity for self-governance with the best intentions of protecting, whether or not we're protecting in terms of the welfare state or your child by not letting them to do certain kind of things, because we're teaching them, we're domesticating them, we're teaching them not to be self-reliant.
Right. And see, it's interesting for me because we got, this, but we got a couple hundred residential recovery beds here in the community. And you'll find me and my son LJ and my daughter Rain, 4 and 3-year-olds, going out to our men's program with 102 residents in it, bringing containers of ice cream and sitting down and having a bowl of ice cream with all of these guys, recovery program. And they don't think anything of it. All of those guys in there are so gracious to my kids. They're kind, they respect. They would protect those kids. This is a program that's taking people and reforming them, through a process of, hey, you weren't the best of person before you came. Come on in. We're going to try to help you get to a better. But they would protect my children with their life. This group of people.
No,
It's majority.
hugely interesting. And when you were saying that, we recently gathered some additional programs interested in becoming part of the Bruce Martin Network. And when you were telling this, I was struck by one of the individuals said his story was he grew up in a very privileged family. He had everything material that he needed. But when he went off to college, he had no idea what his purpose was. So when he was out of kind of that bubble of a protected kind of privileged environment and went off on his own, he was a bit clueless about what to do and how to live and what his purpose and what his direction was. And, so whether or not it's somebody who grew up with nothing or grew up, with privilege, there's something that's happened in his culture that is very similar between them, in terms of undermining this capacity for self-governance.
Can you put your finger on it at all, or is there anything there?
I don't know. I don't know why we've become so risk adverse. It's actually totally bizarre because growing up, like in an elementary school when I was a kid, they had monkey bars. Now they're not safe. The kid might fall down and bruise himself. well, so what? Because, falling off the bike or falling down is part of life.
You kind of
Making
why
mistakes.
why are no kids walking around with gas? Why don't we all had gas?
Yeah. So it's kind of like we've created this, out of the best intentions, this kind of bubble environment. So now parents are trying to rewild their kids or somehow to undo this. So it's not just the other, because it's within the most affluent families. I've also in the term of snowflakes,
Right.
that is, so it's very pervasive across the culture, and it requires some rethink, about we talk about culture wars, but this is culture wide, that we have to rethink. And so I think part of what you're doing in terms of the connection to, faith is the idea that we have an inner direction, an inner capacity that we need to consult, and grow that, because that's part of our sense of autonomy, but within that, is that there's a recognition to your faith that my interest and your interest, the interests of myself and others are not separate. We need to be able to treat the other as ourselves, and as opposed to putting them at a distance. So somehow we need to figure out how to regrow that sense of inner direction.
Yeah, there's it's a Christian principle of the do unto others, and even the idea of I'm my brother's keeper, are both, I would say, really closely intersected with this type of thing that we're describing. You know, everybody in the world kind of appreciates different things, and they come from a place of different values. And I would say that you're probably found more as far as characteristically who you are by the way that you interact with people who are different more than alike. And I would say that, similar for me, that I started learning so much more. I just think it's a personal experience for me. I started learning so much more from people when I was willing to hear people and try to kind of figure it out, almost looking like the inside of a clock sometimes. Like, they seem like a really intelligent, reasonable person. Why do they act like that? So different. So like trying to understand those things just because not that they were on the face value wrong and I should just stiff arm them to the side, but because there's something going on there that I don't understand. So I try to get curious with it. So back to the beginning part, that didn't come natural to me. My natural inclination was when it looked, smelled, and tasted different, I didn't really want to engage with it. Do you share that common first instinct, or was yours different?
I don't know. I think that's also very taught, and that's much a functional kind of context in terms of what you're exposed to. That if you're exposed to difference, that I think we find that it's not threatening. Somehow we treat difference as threatening,
That's a good comment.
as
Yeah.
opposed to if you want to learn anything, you actually integrate differences. If you want to learn something, you lean into difference. If you want to stay the same, you lean into your own perspective and people who talk and think like you. That's our kind of echo chambers is a formula for growing stupid, for becoming ignorant. And you simply say, my group knows they're all. But in fact, if we want to learn to solve problems, then if you see somebody has a different perspective, a different view, you should lean into it. And if you experience conflict, you should lean into the conflict because you'll learn most from difference, most from conflict, as opposed to fighting conflict and fighting difference. And we become a culture that fights conflict. So you can engage conflict and dialogue in a very meaningful kind of way, respectful kind of way, but you're going to learn a lot more than simply, you know, talking to the usual suspects.
Yeah, I found that to be really true. Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. Do you Are you particularly proud of the work that we're doing today with the Bridge to 100 and being able to bring this type of faith and science recovery model into being?
Yeah, I am, but I began the process of being a bit wary, you know, um, because again, this notion of dualism, we have dualistic, is it faith or science that has the solution as opposed to faith and science. So a lot of us become one party has a solution, the other party has a solution, the few is science but faith. In some ways, I almost think that the breakdown in communion and trust of difference in one another really says a lot about that breakdown in trust says a lot about how we're reacting to science because we become just don't trust experts, whether or not they're politicians or scientists or whomever. So if you want to trust science again, you actually have to work with people in science and lean into the difference that you may find threatening.
Does trusting the science come first in our society, maybe by trusting the person?
Yeah, I think you always have to trust the person, first and understand where they come from and what their intention is. And also, for science, I think in some people, this culture, science has become a faith when it's a tool. It's a means, it's not an end. If anybody's closer to, sense of ends and means, ends is more likely to be reached and in a pathway of faith, not science. Science should be in service to ends. So that kind of that combining those two is really, really key.
I gotta tell you, before we sign off here, one of the most rewarding things that I've gotten since we've started working together and since I've been able to start learning from you are these really early in the morning conversations that we get to have. And just being able to hear what your thoughts are and pulling from your experiences over your career and the different places that you've traveled and seen and been, kind of all in the same framework of all this work. It gives you a lot to mull over. And one of the questions that you've asked me, and this is what I was segueing into, Josh, how often do you actually think? How much time do you have to think? Do you remember when you asked me that? And I now find myself asking my other team members about that. When's the last time you gave yourself just some time to think? But that's what this type of work, it really challenges me because it puts me into a framework that I'm not naturally schooled in. And it forces me into those wee hours of the morning to ponder and mull and think. So that's a gift you've given to me. So I really appreciate that about you.
No, I think it's very important. Thinking is reflection. If you say to yourself, I'm going to take time to think, it's almost, you almost feel a visceral think. When you're thinking, you find yourself kind of going up and down almost into your body. It's almost, you can feel it as opposed to not thinking and simply reacting and doing in the moment. So thinking is probably the best way, being reflective, to access what it is you value and use that to filter your thoughts and the choice you make as opposed to simply reacting.
Yeah, absolutely. Today's conversation, self governance, a pathway to freedom. And this is Dr. Gary Nelson. If you haven't read his book, Robin Hayes and I recommend that
Thank
you
you.
read his book. Yeah, self governance in communities and families. And the other one is,
So the other one I'm working on is actually, a story about why we're in the mess we're in. So you have to stay tuned for what.
are you going to give us a sneak peek of the launch date of it? Or are you still working? Are you still in midstream?
Well, I think when later this afternoon, you and I and others will be talking about bringing the community together. So part of that will begin to address that. I mean, how do you bring a community together? Because individually, individually, we know a little bit. Together with other people, different perspectives, we know a lot.
No, uh,
So communities come together. I'll just close off with this. We went to, and it speaks to community. We went out to dinner with some friends because it was a celebration, and we went to Chapel Hill, and we sat down and looked at the menu, and the prices were just unbelievable in terms of what's happened in the last couple of years in terms of prices. So we ended up opening an appetizer, and that was kind of it. But on the way home, we said, I said to my friends, okay, going forward, we're going to do more potlucks. We're going to bring people to our house. People bring things. I grew up, going out to eat was rare, but when you have a potluck, everybody brings something. That's actually a way to get to know your neighbors and your friends and to pull that. So it may not be bad that if we enter a period of scarcity, it'll will question our kind of putting so much stock into material things and put more investment in let's just get together, let's talk to each other, let's you know, know our family members, as opposed to build a big house and your kids up in the far distant corner watching TV on the phone in the boat. And you don't spend time getting together for meals, the family, let alone friends. So it's true. That was kind of an interesting takeaway. So community, we should do more potlucks.
Well, we're going to stay tuned for that book.
Okay.
And you know who's notoriously great at potlucks? The church.
Yes.
We could go around to the Baptist, we could score which denomination does it the best for potlucks. The guys, Dr. Gary Nelson, thank you.
Thank you
for making the trip down here and being with us today.
My pleasure.
You've been able to hear the insights about self-governance and all of the work that he's kind of accumulated from his book. A reminder, Self-Governance in Communities and Families. Make sure you get it, read it. We're going to see you next time.